Hello, friends. So, we're going to talk about the 100 Years' War today, and also we will talk about Joan of Arc's influence on it and the outcome of it. And there's varying opinions on whether she essentially won the war for France, and we will get to that towards the end. But first, a little background on the 100 Years' War. 100 Years' War started in the year 1337. There were territorial disputes between England and France, and it all goes back to 1066 when William of Normandy became King of England. Because there was a Norman line of kings, English monarchs had lands within France. Those lands made the English kings subjects to whoever the monarchs of France happened to be at the time. The French kings would come in and take land that belonged to English noblemen. In 1328, Charles IV of France died with no male heir. Charles's first closest relative was Edward III of England, whose mother Isabella was Charles's sister. French noblemen, though, did not want an English king on the throne, so instead they decided to put Charles's cousin Philip on the throne. After some protest, Edward actually agreed to this, but Philip also attempted to push forth a claim to the Gascony region of southwest France, which was an English possession. So I'm going to take just a moment to trace the Gascony region. So angered by the claim on Gascony, Edward reclaimed the French throne, which started the 100 Years' War. By 1337, Edward III invaded France. In spite of having a larger population and defensive advantages, England dealt some major blows to France early on. Some city-states who wanted to remain independent, such as cities in Flanders, dependent on English wool, offered their allegiance to Edward III. Although Edward III had some issues with funding and Flanders fell back to France, civil war in Brittany in 1364 gave Edward another opportunity to wage war once again. And I'm going to trace Brittany for you guys in just a second here as I finish the trace for Gascony. So by 1342, Edward occupied Brittany, and by 1346, Edward then attacked Normandy with 15,000 troops. He seized the town of Caen and then headed towards Flanders in an attempt to restart that conflict. On the way there, he went through the town of Crécy, and the French army, who had been following the English's movements, engaged them on August 26, 1346. In spite of the French outnumbering the English prevailed, and many of the French lords and captains died. So what you're looking at is a map showing the route that Edward took across the English Channel as he attempted to take Normandy. This was the route that he went. So by this time, Philip had escaped to Paris, and so Edward then sieged Calais and eventually starved the town into submission. This was a big gain for the English due to the proximity to England. It allowed resupplying of troops and supplies very easily through that town. But by this point, the progress that he made was stymied by the Black Death, which was raging in Europe from 1348 to 1349. This blow to the English's army changed the way that Edward would have to fight. Instead of sieging, he would start burning and pillaging lands. By 1350, Philip died and was replaced on the French throne by his son, John II. By 1356, John fought England at Poitiers, lost and was captured and taken to the Tower of London. The Treaty of Brittany was signed, which released John, but France had to pay England 3 million golden crowns. France also had to cede Aquitaine, Ponthieu, and Calais. In exchange, Edward renounced his claim to the French throne, but the money owed to England was slow in being paid out by France. John had to remain in prison at the Tower of London, and his son Charles kept fighting on his behalf until 1364, when John died in London, ascending Charles V to the French throne. Charles V did have some victories as king over the English, and he had actually taken back Aquitaine and started making headway in Brittany as well. It did not hurt as well that both Edward III died, and his son, also named Edward, died, leaving a child, Richard II, as heir to the English throne. And France had also made some headway even after Charles V died and his son Charles VI ascended. By that time, England essentially was close to losing Calais and Gascony due to both the state of flux the English royalty was in and the backlash to the harsh tactics that the English used in their subjugation. So by 1394, Richard II, who was already dealing with turmoil in his own homeland, called for peace, which lasted for a couple of decades. During that time, Richard II was overthrown and killed by his cousin Henry IV. Charles VI, for his part, was in a state of mental illness. John the Fearless, who was the Duke of Burgundy, and Louis, Duke of Orleans, were both vying for power. Louis tried to take the lands previously lost to the English, mainly Gascony. John, on the other hand, wanted to make peace with England and had allied Burgundy with Flanders, which of course was pro-English. In 1407, Louis, Duke of Orleans, was assassinated, and John was immediately blamed for it. So France had two factions, those that backed John the Fearless, which was the Burgundian faction, and those that backed Louis, and those were actually the Armagnac faction, which I'm going to show you. Armagnac is located in the southern part of France. But John had made a strategic move by deciding to ally with the English. Henry IV sent some troops to aid the different territories against the Armagnacs. So the Armagnacs were now having to fight both the English and the Burgundians. By March of 1413, Henry IV died, ascending Henry V to the English throne. Henry V, unlike his father, had no intention of honoring any aspects of the previous treaty with France. In August 1415, Henry landed 8,000 soldiers on the mouth of the Seine River, surprising the French and losing the town of Harfleur to the English. The English continued winning victory after victory, including a huge one called the Battle of Agincourt, where 10,000 French soldiers died, including many French nobles and counts. Their death left a huge state of flux as Henry entered Calais and then crossed the English Channel to gloat of his victory and increase his ranks to make his next assault on France. On August 1st, 1417, Henry returned, and the Dukes of Burgundy and Brittany, who hated the current French regime, did not oppose him, leaving very little opposition for Henry. So Henry continued trying to subjugate Normandy and essentially had it taken, but then had to siege Rouen, the capital of Normandy, and after 6 months Rouen fell. Meanwhile, John the Fearless and the Burgundians were taking territory en route to Paris. By now, John the Fearless was still having designs on ruling France, but he knew that in order to do so, he would have to share ruling France with Henry and the English. This was not his intention or his desire, and really by this time he wanted to take Paris. The Parisians, for their part, were divided, with some pro-Armagnac and some pro-Burgundian. Charles VI saw the writing on the wall and could see where this was headed when Bernard, a leader of Armagnac, was killed. The Parisians opened up the gates to John the Fearless, and Charles had no choice but to be subject to John, while Charles's son fled south away from his enemies. By 1419, John put together a government. He was apparently interested by this time in making peace with some of his Armagnac enemies and trying to regain lands lost to the English, but was assassinated by some Armagnac dissidents. Philip the Good, who was John's son, now the Burgundian leader, wanted nothing to do with the Armagnacs who killed his father, and now tried to ally with Henry V. So in May 1420, Philip the Good signed a treaty with Henry and also Charles VI, which made Henry V heir to the French throne, disowning Charles's son. The treaty, called the Treaty of Troyes, essentially gave Henry V power at the expense of the Armagnacs. The treaty, though, was not honored by the Armagnacs. But an unforeseen thing then happened. Henry V contracted dysentery and died August of 1422. Charles VI died the same year, leaving Henry VI as heir to both the English and French thrones. But the Armagnacs at this point fought harder against the English and Burgundians. While Henry VI was too young to fight wars, he had uncles that were fighting on his behalf. One was Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, who was headed to take Orleans, a very key strategic town on the Loire River. If Thomas was to take Orleans, it could essentially spell the end for the Armagnacs. On the way to Orleans, he took Chartres, Le Poussey, and Meung, and by October the 12th, he began sieging Orleans. This is where Joan of Arc entered into the picture, and this is where everything would change in the 100 Years' War. So no one knows for sure what Joan of Arc looked like. I'm flashing up a few different depictions as we go, but the depictions are very different. Some have her with long hair, short hair, in dresses, in full armor, with a womanly figure with a boyish shape, with different hair colors, though some claim a strand of her hair was found that was black in color. But because of the way she was executed, there's no way to know for sure. Some have suggested that Joan was a peasant. This is actually not true. While she wasn't of noble birth, her family was not poor. In fact, her father was thought to be a farmer who owned a sizable piece of land. So here is a picture of the house where Joan of Arc was raised in Domremy. Her parents were no doubt supporters of Charles VI and his son Charles's right to ascend to the throne, and were opposed to Henry VI and the Burgundians. They were most certainly devout Catholics. It is thought that Joan's mother, Isabel, had been on a pilgrimage to Rome. One childhood friend described Joan of Arc's devotion like this. At age 13, she began hearing the voice of God. At first, the voice told her to go to church and conduct herself well, but as she got older, it all changed. The voice started giving her instructions about how to deal with the English siege of Orleans. So the voice instructed Joan to go to Vaucouleurs to meet with Robert de Baudricourt, who would help her raise an army. And you can see this map here that I have displayed up on the screen. You can see Vaucouleurs is pretty close to Domremy, where Joan lived. But then you see some of the other cities and how they are in relation to Domremy and so forth. You can see how they've allied. Different cities have pretty much have different factions that are in control of them. And you can kind of see by looking at this map the sites that are occupied by French troops. Those are designated by a solid circle, and the ones that are the Burgundian troops are the clear circles. And you can see that on this map, Domremy is the Burgundian troop occupied area. So that would eventually happen. As we go here, I'll get into that a little bit. Joan at this point is in Vaucouleurs, and Baudricourt met with her but would not honor Joan's request to meet with the Dauphin, who was the son of Charles VI. Joan continued to plead her case but returned home. But in July of 1428, Burgundy attacked Domremy, which was Joan's hometown. Some believed that Burgundy might have heard the rumors on Joan trying to raise an army and wanted to quell the insurrection. Joan and her family escaped, and eventually Baudricourt sent for Joan, but he wasn't prepared to send her to meet with Charles the Dauphin. He was afraid of his reaction to Joan, but by February 1429, Baudricourt sent for her a third time and gave her a sword. Also, he clothed Joan in men's clothing in order to make riding a horse more comfortable for her. The Dauphin Charles was at Chinon when Joan rode there to meet him. This was very risky as she had to ride through towns that were occupied by the enemy, but Joan was not deterred at all and believed in her cause. She sometimes rode at night and slept during the day. By late February or March of 1429, Joan arrived in Chinon. Charles was hesitant to meet with her at first, but upon realizing the background of her visions and what she had endured in order to get there, he agreed to meet with her. She told him that he was the true heir to the French throne. Not much else was really said of their conversation, but Charles later said it was as if the Holy Ghost had visited him. Joan was interviewed by different theologians who she explained her mission to. God tasked her with one mission, was breaking the English siege of Orleans and leading Charles to Rheims to be crowned king. After being grilled for days, the theologians became convinced that her visions were completely on the level, so Charles clothed her in armor. She also acquired a sword by explaining that a vision told her of a sword that was at a monastery buried behind an altar. Incredibly, the sword was exactly where she said it would be. She was now ready to lead the Dauphin's army. One might think, as patriarchal as 15th century Europe was, that young men wouldn't want to be led by a woman. But her fame had been spread far and wide, and people saw her as a saint, and over 10,000 soldiers were recruited. And the task began to break up the siege of Orleans. The siege had been moving along pretty well for England, in spite of some setbacks, including the death of Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury. Most of the French army had retreated and left Orleans for Tours, but in Orleans, whispers of hope had begun. It helped the resistance there when they heard of Joan coming with an army. Not only that, Joan had sent a letter to the English informing of her mission. King of England, you call yourself regent of the kingdom of France. Render your account to the King of Heaven. Surrender to the maid who is sent here from God, the King of Heaven, the keys to all the good cities that you have taken and violated in France. She has come here from God to proclaim the blood royal. She is entirely ready to make peace if you are willing to settle accounts with her, provided you give up France and pay for having occupied her. I shall make them leave it whether they wish to or not, and if they will not obey, I shall have them killed. Believe firmly that the King of Heaven will send the maid more force than you know how to achieve in all your assaults. Joan had entered Orleans on April 29th, 1429. Surprisingly, she entered the city without conflict, but Orleans resistant fighters had the siegers engaged in a battle which created a nice diversion to distract the English away from Joan. But Joan became frustrated because it seemed that some of the French military and even the English were trying to avoid conflict by remaining behind the protective barricades. Joan was frustrated because she felt that they were blocking her mission. She sent further letters to the English, one even threatening to kill English prisoners. The English sent a message saying that they would torture and burn her, and the English also said that she should return to the farm and her cattle. Joan went through the streets of Orleans, boosting the morale of the fighters while distributing food and medicine. Jean de Noailles, a French commander, had been trying to bring reinforcements, including provisions, into the town, and the English decided to challenge the troops. But Joan of Arc went with the rest of the army to help bring the provisions in. The French numbered 1,500 in their attack, with de Noailles and Joan leading the assault on Saint-Loup. It was a resounding French victory. Joan wasn't done and suggested another assault. The commanders decided, though, to wait a day. While they waited, Joan had picked up additional reinforcements by raising an urban militia. The French crossed the Loire River on a pontoon bridge and forced an English retreat, but additional English reinforcements were heading upriver as the French were chasing them. Once the French realized that the larger contingent of British forces were coming, panic set in, and the French retreated, dragging an angry Joan of Arc with them. The English chased them, but according to legend, Joan raised up her holy standard and said, "In the name of God," which had an effect of demoralizing the English and firing up the French troops, who then launched an assault on St. Augustine's, which they took at dusk. The next day, Joan joined an assault on Boulevard Tourelle complex and was shot between the neck and left shoulder by an arrow. According to one of the chaplains, Joan had some sort of foreknowledge that this would actually happen, and told the chaplain the day before, "Tomorrow blood will flow above my breast." This hurt French morale to see their Maid of Orleans down. The assault ceased for the evening, but then after a period of prayer, Joan returned and implored the French by saying, "All is yours, go in." The French rushed into Tourelle, forcing the English out, and they retreated, crossing a drawbridge. The drawbridge collapsed, killing the main English captain named Glasdale. The Tourelle was taken, with the English suffering heavy casualties. At this point, the English lost the south bank of the river and decided to retreat Orleans altogether. Joan and the other French commanders marched out of Orleans, meeting the Dauphin Charles at Tours. They then began a campaign of taking all fortifications around the Loire. This was also a successful campaign and strategically had the English in a quandary. After winning several other victories, the French were ready to fulfill Joan's prophecy of marching on Rheims, and with Joan by his side, King Charles VII was coronated on July 17, 1429. Charles VII worked to arrange a truce with the Duke of Burgundy, which lasted for 15 days before Burgundy again resumed fighting the French Armagnacs. By September 8th, Joan and the Armagnacs assaulted Paris. The French suffered many casualties and Charles halted the attack. After this defeat, Joan's influence on Charles greatly decreased. Some even claimed that her visions were no longer divine, but she continued serving the French army, but had suffered more defeats, further damaging her reputation. Charles negotiated a truce with Burgundy, which was to last until Easter of 1430. The Duke of Burgundy had tried to take control of towns that Charles had given him as part of the treaty, but in many cases they did not submit. One of them was Compiègne. Joan of Arc came to the aid of the town, trying to hold off Burgundy's siege. Joan was captured and turned over to the English, who immediately tried her for heresy, based on her wearing of men's clothes and also claiming that her visions were demonic. May 30th, 1431, she was declared guilty and burned at the stake at only 19 years old. By 1456, the Roman Catholic Church reinvestigated her trial and overturned the verdict. She was then viewed as a martyr, and in 1920, the Roman Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. As far as her impact on the 100 Years' War, it did rage on for 2 more decades, so while it can't really be said that she directly won the war for France, it can certainly be said that her efforts were a turning point for the French. It could be easily speculated that France would have most certainly have lost if not for her. So it cannot be overstated the effect that she had on getting Henry VII onto the throne. So I'm going to leave you with this last quote regarding Joan of Arc. I think it really kind of sums up very well why she was important. Why is she so celebrated? No doubt the partiality of her trial and the nature of her execution had something to do with her celebrity, but other individuals, men and women, were tried and burned for supposed heresy and not honored with sainthood, let alone with the number of statues, pieces of artwork, literature, and legends awarded to the maid's memory. Joan's renown is attached to her military ability and the skill that she had leading men into battle against great odds and possible death. This made the greatest influence on her time. French military leaders, some that she had fought with, began to adopt similar tactics to those that she employed. As other French generals began to use it, they too began to be victorious. I appreciate your attention for this video. Thank you so much for supporting my channel. Thank you for subscribing. And I'm now over 200 subscribers, so I just want to once again thank everyone.